I always knew that one day that old mirror would end up in my hands. It had belonged to my family for generations, passed from one relative to another like a cursed heirloom. When I finally received it, a shiver ran down my spine, as if I had just accepted a burden I couldn't rid myself of. The mirror was a masterpiece, undeniably beautiful, but there was something wrong with it. The frame, made of dark wood worn by time, displayed hand-carved details, almost as if each curve and scrollwork hid a secret. It was heavy, with a slightly stained surface that never seemed completely clean, no matter how much I tried to polish it. Since it was installed in the hallway of my home, I noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. The lighting, once soft and welcoming, seemed to be absorbed by the presence of that mirror. During the day, the hallway felt colder, and at night, I avoided walking past it. It wasn't just an ordinary reflection it returned. It was something deeper, darker. I clearly remember the first night I noticed something was wrong. It was late, and I was going upstairs to my room. As I walked through the hallway, an unusual glint caught my eye. I looked at the mirror. My reflection was there, standing still, but something was subtly different. For a brief moment, I swore I saw it move, even though I remained motionless. A shudder ran through my body, but I shook my head and laughed at myself. I'm going crazy. It's just fatigue. But the feeling of discomfort didn't leave me. The next day, as I had breakfast, an old memory came to mind. My grandmother, in her later years, used to murmur something about the mirror. "That mirror isn't normal," she would say with a distant look. I was too young to understand or care at the time, but now those words echoed in my mind, reverberating with a meaning I had never grasped before. It made sense that the mirror ended up with me. After all, I was the only one who cared about keeping some of the old family traditions. But now, with it in my house, I began to question whether it was an honor or a curse. Every time I walked past it, I felt as if something was watching me. It wasn't just the reflection of my own figure, but something behind it, a presence I couldn't see directly, but that was there, waiting. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was all just my imagination. However, deep down, something in me knew that the mirror held more than just a reflection of reality. It kept secrets, stories that my family preferred not to tell, and I was starting to understand why. The stories about the mirror were always told in whispers. No member of my family spoke openly about the events surrounding that object, but the whispers persisted. They were rumors, fragments of conversations overheard through cracked doors during funerals, family gatherings, and occasionally, in more intimate talks with older relatives. Those who seemed to carry the weight of these stories with a mix of sadness and reluctance. I remember the first time I heard about great-grandfather Joao. I was young, no more than 10 years old, and I was at my grandparents' house for Sunday lunch. The adults were in the dining room, talking in hushed voices while the children played in the yard. But something in the conversation caught my attention. I heard my aunt whisper to my mother, "You remember what happened to old Joao, don't you? After he locked that door. It was right after he brought the mirror into the house." She spoke with a seriousness I had never seen in her usually cheerful expressions. Curious, I moved closer to the door and listened. My mother replied in a tense tone, "He was never the same. He stayed in that room for days. When they finally found him, it was too late. The mirror was there, on the floor, and his look." She stopped, as if the words were too difficult to say. The silence that followed was heavy, and I knew there was something more there, something no one wanted to admit. Over the years, I began piecing together the scattered stories from my family. Great-grandfather Joao wasn't the only one marked by the presence of the mirror. There was also the story of Great Aunt Clara. She was a vibrant woman, full of life, until the day she decided to take the mirror to her home. Soon after, her personality changed drastically. Clara started locking herself in her room for hours, muttering to herself, obsessed with the reflection. They told me that in the weeks leading up to her commitment to the asylum, she began talking about someone in the mirror, a shadowy figure that watched her, that smiled at her, but wasn't her reflection. When she was finally found, she was in a state of shock, unable to say anything except one sentence: "He's here. He's inside me." My grandmother had her stories too. When I was a child, I used to visit her during the holidays. It was an old house, full of dark hallways and heavy wooden furniture. At the time, I didn't know about the mirror, but I noticed it in a corner of the living room, covered by a thick blanket, as if it were a piece of furniture no one used anymore. I never saw it uncovered, and my grandmother seemed to have a strange relationship with that corner of the room. Every time we passed by it, she would hold my hand tighter and quicken her pace, as if something there deeply disturbed her. One night, during a particularly quiet evening, I asked her why that mirror was always covered. She stopped for a moment, stared blankly into the distance, and then, without looking directly at me, whispered, "Some things weren't meant to be seen by all eyes, dear, especially those that live in the reflection." These stories, though fragmented and full of gaps, formed a frightening image in my mind. The mirror seemed to be a point of convergence for inexplicable events, tragedies that were somehow connected. No one spoke of the mirror as if it were directly responsible, but its presence was always there, like a shadow that refused to disappear. My family, who had always been practical and rational, had an irrational fear of that object. They kept it out of respect for tradition, but never spoke of it lightly. There was always hesitation, a pause, whenever the subject came up. And now, that mirror was in my house. A piece of my family's dark history was under my roof, and though I wanted to believe it was just old stories and superstitions, the truth is that fear began to grow within me. It was as if the mirror had a presence of its own, a kind of energy that couldn't be ignored. I started catching myself looking at it more than I should, as if I was waiting for something to happen. There were moments when I walked through the hallway and felt a heavy presence, as if the air around it was different, denser. I began avoiding the mirror whenever I could, but still, it seemed to call to me, drawing my eyes, even against my will. That's when I began having nightmares. In the first one, I was alone at home. The light was dim, almost extinguished, and the mirror, for no apparent reason, was in the center of the room. I approached it slowly, unable to control my movements, and when I looked at the reflection, I saw something behind me, an indistinct shadow, faceless, but with such an oppressive presence that I woke up in a cold sweat. The nightmare repeated itself, each time more vivid, and the figure behind me seemed to get closer with each dream, as if it was waiting for the right moment to cross the barrier between the reflection and the real world. I knew I couldn't keep ignoring the history of the mirror. There was something about it, something that went beyond the old, superstitious stories of my family. Something that was now beginning to manifest in my own life. It didn't take long for the nightmares to start creeping into my waking life. What had once been a quiet unease turned into something tangible, something I could feel around me, even when my eyes weren't fixed on the mirror. My mind, which I had once believed to be a fortress against superstitions and irrational fear, began to crumble. Small details stood out, as if reality itself was bending around me. It all started with subtle sounds, almost imperceptible, but once noticed, impossible to ignore. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would hear creaks coming from the hallway, as if the wood was groaning under the weight of something that shouldn't be there. Other times, there were whispers, indistinct words like a distant murmur that seemed to come from behind the mirror's frame. I would get up, walk through the dark hallway, and as I approached the mirror, absolute silence would fall. Oppressive, too heavy to be a coincidence. It was on one of those nights that something changed. I had woken up again, sweaty and with my heart racing, the nightmare still fresh in my mind. This time, I had been in my own bedroom, and the figure had been closer than ever. When I woke, the feeling that I wasn't alone remained with me. In the dim light of my room, my eyes were drawn to the hallway mirror, as if some invisible force was pushing me in that direction. I knew I shouldn't, but I went over to it. In the middle of the darkness, the reflection seemed different. For a moment, I thought I saw something deep within the image, something that didn't belong to the environment around me. With my heart racing, I moved closer, straining my eyes to get a better look at what was happening. Then, with a shiver that ran down my spine, I saw. It wasn't just a distorted shadow. It was a face, pale and with hollow eyes, peeking out from behind my reflection. I quickly stepped back, hitting the wall behind me. My reflection, however, didn't immediately move as it should have. For a second, it remained there, still, staring at me with a neutral expression. But those empty eyes, they seemed to look directly into me, judging every fear, every weakness I had. That night was the breaking point. I couldn't sleep anymore, and by dawn, I knew something had to be done. The mirror wasn't just an old decoration, nor just a bizarre family heirloom. It was something more, a portal to something I didn't understand but that clearly had dark intentions. I decided to seek help, but not in the usual places. Going to a therapist or talking to friends about it would sound ridiculous. I knew no one would believe me. So, I began researching the mirror, trying to uncover its origins. My family's stories were old, but vague. I needed more. I needed to understand what was really behind that object. After days of digging through family archives, old correspondence, and ancient records, I finally found a lead. One of my great-grandmother's diaries mentioned a name, Joaquim Noguera. He was an alchemist and occultist known in the late 17th century, famous for his bizarre and controversial experiments. His obsession? Capturing the essence of evil. The mirror had been one of his most ambitious creations, an experiment intended to reveal the hidden truth within men's souls. But something went wrong, terribly wrong. According to the fragmented notes I found, Joaquim believed the mirror could not only reflect the essence of evil but also trap it. What he hadn't anticipated was that in trying to capture evil, he would end up creating a link between our world and something much darker, something that fed on human weaknesses and amplified them until sanity was destroyed. My discovery didn't bring relief. Instead, it intensified the terror. The more I read about the mirror, the clearer it became that it was a catalyst for tragedies. It didn't just reveal evil. It summoned it, materialized it, until its victims succumbed to madness or something worse. The worst part came when I discovered that Joaquim Noguera was never seen again after his final experiment with the mirror. His body was never found. Only his notes remained, scattered among collectors and scholars of the occult. But there was something terribly unsettling about one specific note, almost faded by time. He lives in the reflection now. It's no longer me. He took me. And then, everything made sense. The figures I saw in my nightmares, the faces in the mirror, weren't just hallucinations. Joaquim Noguera was there, or at least what was left of him, trapped in that reflection. Not just him, but all those who, over the centuries, had let themselves be consumed by the mirror. I was dealing with an entity that fed on the souls of its victims, growing with each new capture, distorting reality around it. Realizing this, I knew I had to get rid of the mirror. But the problem was bigger than I imagined. It wasn't just an object. It was a parasite, a predator that had already left its mark on me. Even if I got rid of it, I knew it would always be there, lurking in the back of my mind, waiting for the right moment to strike again. But there was something more. As I read Joaquim Nogueira's notes, one last phrase caught my attention. The only way to break the cycle is to face the reflection. Evil can only be contained by the sacrifice of one's own soul. That was a twist I didn't expect. I would have to confront the mirror directly, without fear. But what did that mean? Sacrifice my soul? Was this a metaphor, or was there a literal, dark truth behind those words? I knew I didn't have much time. The presence of the mirror was becoming stronger, more intrusive. It was getting closer to completely consuming me. I needed to act, but the truth was, the closer I got to the mirror, the more I felt it had already begun to control me. And that night, everything came to a head. The lights in the house began to flicker, the air grew dense, as if something was draining all the energy around me. I knew the mirror was waiting. At that moment, I was certain that Joaquim Nogueira wasn't just trapped in the reflection. He was trying to escape. And for that, he needed me. The days following the discovery about Joaquim Nogueira were a blur of fear and tension. I no longer trusted what I saw, not even my own thoughts. The mirror's presence seemed to penetrate every part of my life. It wasn't just the object itself. It was a constant feeling that something was watching me, that my reality was slowly being corroded by an invisible force. I found myself trapped in an obsessive search. The more I tried to distance myself from the mirror, the more I felt I needed to understand it, as if the key to my survival was buried in the depths of its dark history. I spent hours on the computer, researching the alchemist Joaquim Nogueira and his occult practices, digging up every piece of information that could give me some advantage against what I was facing. It was on an occult forum where I found a name that caught my attention, Aline Vasquez. She was a historian and expert in occult artifacts, and from what I read, she had experience with cursed objects and their effects on the human psyche. Reports suggested that she had helped people deal with haunted items, and I knew I needed to speak with her. After exchanging a few emails, Aline agreed to meet me at a discreet cafe in the city. She seemed like the only person who didn't dismiss my story as delusion. When I met her, I was surprised by her serious and professional demeanor, but her eyes revealed something more, a deep weariness, like someone who had seen far more than anyone should. I told her everything, every detail. She listened attentively, without interrupting, only nodding occasionally. When I finished, there was a long silence before she finally spoke. "Mirrors are portals," she said calmly, "and I don't mean that metaphorically. In many cultures, they are seen as doors between our world and other planes of existence. But what you're describing here, this goes beyond that. Joaquim Nogueira wasn't just trying to capture the essence of evil. He was trying to open a permanent passage to something that should never have been touched." Her words left a weight on my chest. I already suspected that the mirror was more than just a cursed object, but hearing this from someone with real knowledge on the subject made everything more real, more dangerous. "What can I do?" I asked, desperate. "How can I get rid of it?" She looked at me, assessing my words as if carefully choosing what to say next. "If it were that simple, the mirror would have been destroyed centuries ago," she replied. "But from what you've told me, it can't be destroyed in the conventional way. It's not just about breaking the glass. What's trapped inside it is ancient. an entity that likely feeds on the souls of those who fall under its control. She paused, then added something that chilled me to the bone. There is a way, but it's dangerous, and I can't guarantee it will work. I leaned forward, anxiously waiting for her response. You'll need to face the entity directly, she continued. The mirror reflects more than just physical appearance. It reflects weaknesses, fears, and amplifies them until you succumb. The only way to break this cycle is to confront the mirror head-on, without looking away, without giving in to terror. You'll have to accept what it shows you, no matter how horrifying, and deny it control. The thought of facing the mirror, knowing what I had already seen in it, was almost unbearable. But Aline was right. Running or trying to escape was no longer an option. The mirror had already trapped me in its web, and the only way out would be through confrontation. And if I fail? I asked, my voice trembling. She looked at me with a brutal honesty. Then you'll become another soul trapped inside it, like your ancestor Joachim, or worse, like the other victims the mirror has claimed over the centuries, and the cycle will continue. That thought terrified me, but it also gave me a new determination. I had to act, and I had to do it soon, before the mirror took everything from me. That night, I returned home with the plan to face the mirror once and for all. I mentally prepared myself, repeating over and over that I couldn't look away, that I had to resist anything it showed me. But deep down, a cruel doubt still lingered. Was I strong enough for this? When night fell and darkness engulfed the house, I approached the mirror in the hallway. The feeling that something was lurking on the other side was overwhelming, but I pressed on. I positioned myself in front of the mirror, taking deep breaths, and then, with a courage I didn't know I had, I stared at the reflection. For a brief moment, I saw only my own reflection. But then, gradually, the surface of the mirror began to distort. My face twisted, fracturing into multiple versions of myself, each more grotesque and terrifying than the last. My skin seemed to melt, my eyes sank into hollow sockets, and a sinister grin appeared where fear had once been. The mirror was playing with my mind, forcing me to confront the worst versions of myself. For an instant, I thought about looking away, but I remembered Aileen's words. I needed to resist, so I kept staring, even as the horror became unbearable. The distorted versions of me began to overlap, creating a chaos of forms and whispers, but something within me refused to give in. That's when I saw him. Joachim Noguera was there, among the distortions, his pale face and hollow eyes watching me from the other side. It wasn't just a reflection, it was the entity he had unleashed. His hands reached through the mirror, trying to pull me inside, and I could feel the pull, the almost physical tug, trying to drag me into the abyss from which he had never escaped. I fought with everything I had, my mind screaming against the madness that tried to consume me. But there was something more. Something that, in the midst of the chaos, I almost subtly noticed. Amid the distortions and terror, there was a fraction of light, a small spark of hope. It was what remained of my own essence, intact and true. And at that moment, I understood what Aline meant about facing the reflection. It wasn't just about resisting the terror, but finding the truth within myself and using it as a weapon against the mirror. With one final cry of defiance, I clung to that inner light, and something happened. The distortion began to retreat, and Joachim Noguera's face disappeared into the darkness. The mirror, once full of chaos and horror, slowly began to clear, until finally, I was looking at my own reflection again. But this time, it was just me. No distortions, no lurking shadows. I let out a heavy sigh, as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from me. But I knew it wasn't over yet. The mirror was calm now, but the entity hadn't disappeared. I could feel it, waiting, weakened but still present. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. I needed to find a way to end this once and for all. The calm that followed the confrontation with the mirror was only temporary. Even after facing the reflection, I knew that the entity was still there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Every step I took around the house was accompanied by a feeling that the mirror was watching me, calculating its next moves. I was determined to put an end to this once and for all. Joaquim Nogueira's final note echoed in my mind. Evil can only be contained by the sacrifice of one's soul. It was a terrible riddle, a sentence I wasn't sure how to decipher. But I knew that if I didn't, I would end up like all those before me, consumed by the mirror, trapped in an eternity of torment. I went back to seek out Aline, the historian who had guided me this far. I explained what had happened, the details of the confrontation, and she listened in silence, a somber expression on her face. When I finished, she sighed heavily. Sacrificing the soul, she murmured, thoughtful. I don't know if that means physical death, but it certainly means something deeper. The mirror can't be destroyed in the conventional way, but there is a way to neutralize it, at least temporarily. The essence of the evil can be contained, but only if someone voluntarily offers themselves as the guardian of that evil. Her words hit me like a cold blade. I would have to sacrifice myself to contain the entity. But how? How could I do that without completely losing myself? There's an ancient ritual, Aline continued, hesitantly. A containment ritual. You can seal the mirror, but it requires a price. You'll have to connect with it, keep the entity imprisoned within you, and use your own willpower to prevent it from escaping. As long as you're alive, the mirror will remain inert, but you can never stray far from it. It will be with you, always, and the burden will be unbearable for many. The idea of living the rest of my life bound to this curse, carrying the mirror as a constant burden, was terrifying. But what could I do? If I ran, others would suffer. The entity would find new victims, and the cycle of tragedy would continue. Aline offered to help with the ritual, but made it clear that the final decision was mine. I would have to make the sacrifice, or everything I had endured would be in vain. That night, I returned home, knowing the decisive moment had arrived. The mirror was there, in the hallway, seemingly harmless, but I could feel the evil pulsing within it, waiting for the chance to break free. Aline arrived shortly after, bringing the tools needed for the ritual. Black candles, a handful of consecrated salt, and a small leather book, worn by time, which contained the necessary words for the enchantment. The instructions were simple, but their impact was monumental. I had to draw a circle of salt around the mirror, light the candles at each cardinal point, and recite the ancient words that would bind the entity within me. The silence during the preparation was oppressive. The house seemed to shrink around us, as if the very environment was contorting in anticipation of what was to come. Aline guided me through each step, and I followed her instructions, feeling the weight of the decision growing heavier with each passing moment. When everything was ready, she looked at me with a mixture of pity and respect. "This is the point of no return," she said, holding the small book in her hands. "Once we start, there's no going back. Are you ready?" I nodded, trying to stay calm, but inside, my heart was racing. I knew there was no other choice. It was this or the end of any chance for peace, both for me and for those who would come after me. Aline began reciting the ancient words, and I repeated each one, feeling the energy around us shift. The candles flickered, and the air in the room seemed to condense, becoming heavier. Suddenly, I felt a presence stir inside the mirror. The entity was aware of what we were doing, and it didn't like it one bit. When we finished the enchantment, the surface of the mirror began to pulse as if it were alive. The glass warped, almost as if it were melting, and I could see shadows moving within it, trying to escape. The pain I felt in that moment was indescribable. It was as if something was tearing my soul apart, piece by piece, and pulling it into the mirror. But I held on. I used every ounce of my willpower to resist, to keep the entity trapped as it tried to break free. My hands trembled, sweat poured down my face, and I felt as if I were on the verge of collapse. But finally, the pain began to subside, and the mirror returned to its original state, still and silent. I had done it. The ritual worked. The entity was trapped within me, and as long as I lived, the mirror would no longer be a threat to anyone. But the price was far too high. I knew that from that moment on, my life would never be the same. The mirror was an extension of me now, and I could feel its presence constantly, like a shadow that never dissipated. Every glance at my reflection was a reminder of the evil contained within, waiting patiently for any sign of weakness. Aline helped me lock the mirror away in a metal safe, reinforced with protective symbols. She looked at me one last time before leaving, knowing our work was done, but that the real battle was just beginning for me. The following days were ones of adjustment, but the feeling of always being watched never left me. Sometimes, at night, when everything was silent, I could swear I heard whispers coming from the mirror, trying to lure me back, trying to break my resolve. But I was determined to keep the entity trapped, no matter the cost. Now, the mirror remains locked away, sealed, and hidden from the world. And I, the reluctant guardian, live with the dark presence that inhabits my reflection. I don't know how long I can resist, but for now, the evil remains contained. But I know that one day, it will try to break free again. And when that day comes, I hope I have the strength to face it once more. Until then, the mirror waits, and so do I.